Have you ever wondered what would have happened if Luffy had 𝐬𝐵's covenant? How strong would he be in this scenario? And most importantly, would he be able to resist 𝐬𝐵's control? So for this scenario to work, I'm going to assume Dragon, Luffy's father, was a lot more active and became a much bigger threat to 𝐬𝐵 and the world government. Because of this, 𝐬𝐵 would use all resources at his disposal to figure out where Dragon and his family were. Although 𝐬𝐵 wouldn't find Dragon himself, he would find baby Luffy alone in their home. 𝐬𝐵 would then place his abyssal covenant on the boy's body in an attempt to corrupt him and punish Dragon for his actions. Instantly, Luffy would find himself getting corrupted with the power of 𝐬𝐵 surging through him, and he would fall to the floor unconscious. Finding Luffy in this state when he returned home, Dragon would once again swear to destroy the world government and hand Luffy over to 𝐷ARP, believing he would be safer with him. While living with the bandits in Fuchsia Village, Luffy would grow up like any normal kid, but everyone would know there was something a little off about it. One day, when the red hair pirates decided to visit the village, something inside Luffy would make him go visit the pirates. And that's when he would come across Shanks. Feeling some kind of weird connection to Shanks, Luffy would begin spending time with him, with Shanks eventually realizing that the boy had the same covenant marking as himself. Eventually, as fate would have it, Luffy would accidentally eat the gum fruit without anyone noticing. Immediately panicking at the thought of one of 𝐬𝐵's followers getting the powers of Nika, Shanks would freak out before ultimately calming himself and asking Luffy about his mark. After learning that Luffy is actually a good kid, Shanks would breathe a sigh of relief, realizing that the fruit probably chose him for some reason. From then on, Luffy would begin showing signs of his increased strength and endless durability. When a mountain bear attacked him and his brothers, Luffy's body would get cut clean in half, but regenerate almost instantly. His brothers would be shocked by this and decide to keep his powers a secret from the rest of the village. However, that wouldn't stop them from experimenting on Luffy every chance they got to better learn how his powers worked. It's also around this time that Luffy would start having nightmares of a mysterious hooded figure. In those nightmares, Luffy would have no control over himself and would be forced to do anything 𝐬𝐵 tells him. But before we continue and explain all the crazy things that would happen to Luffy in this scenario, I want to tell you guys about Blue Protocol Star Resonance, the sponsor of today's video. Star Resonance is an MMORPG where you can explore an amazing anime-inspired world. You can create your own hero, team up for strategic raids, or just enjoy fishing and crafting with your friends. But that's not all, because starting today, Star Resonance also has a special collaboration with Fairy Tail. During this event, you'll be able to get cool Fairy Tail collectibles and outfits, fight limited time bosses, and even have Natsu and Lucy join the battle with you. Also, when season 3 begins, Star Resonance will give out amazing login rewards, including rare items to help kickstart your journey. Star Resonance is also adding a brand new class called Twin Striker. This class is perfect for players who love high octane fights and maintaining crazy combos. By now, you should definitely want to download Star Resonance, but if I still haven't convinced you, there are also 3 new maps, 6 brand new dungeons to explore, and even a new game mode called Musical System, where you can build your music career in-game and become a star. Oh, and did I mention that there is a new EU server offering better latency for players in Europe and surrounding regions? Click my link in the description to download Star Resonance for free now and claim all the amazing rewards today. Eventually, once he turned 17, Luffy would set out to sea to become the Pirate King, same as he did in the original story. He would soon find himself aboard Alvida's ship, where he would save Kobe and send Alvida flying away. In Shellstown, Luffy would also save Zoro and take a direct axe swing from Morgan without even trying to defend himself. Of course, he would instantly regenerate, shocking both Zoro and the Marine captain. But Luffy wouldn't be done traumatizing his foes just yet, because at Orangetown, he would also end up freaking Buggy out with his regeneration abilities too. You see, since Buggy used to be a part of Roger's crew, seeing Luffy would probably remind him of the stories he heard about the God Knights, who had the same marking as him. Realizing that Luffy is someone extremely dangerous, Buggy would instantly stop fighting and start begging for mercy instead. However, this wouldn't work, as he had already messed with the townspeople and Luffy's crew. So, Buggy would soon get punched into the sky as well. At Syrup Village, the story would go similarly to the original. Luffy would befriend Usopp and easily deal with Kuro, who would be completely shocked by how Luffy regenerated from all of his sharp slashes. With Usopp on board, the crew would soon make their way toward Baratie. Everything would play out mostly the same up until the point where Mihawk defeats Zoro. From here, instead of leaving, Mihawk would decide to stick around and observe Luffy, sensing something evil inside the boy. Defeating Krieg would be easy for this version of Luffy, but right after he lands the final blow, something weird would happen. Immediately, Luffy would realize that he can't control his body and would just continue punching Krieg more and more. Sanji and Usopp would quickly jump in to calm Luffy down before he actually kills Krieg. Seeing the mark on Luffy's arm, Mihawk would decide to test his theory and send a few slashing attacks straight at him. Despite having his head chopped clean off, Luffy's body would just fuse back together right in front of everyone's eyes. Angry at Mihawk, Luffy would send a punch aimed right at him, but it would get parried easily. Thinking that Luffy is a member of the God Knights, Mihawk would decide not to fight him at this point, since he wouldn't want to mess with the government. Although, sensing the growing darkness inside the boy, Mihawk would offer him some advice before leaving. He would tell him that if he wanted to control what's inside him, the only way to do it would be through training his haki. Nobody on Luffy's crew would know what haki even is at this point, so they wouldn't pay much attention to it and would just continue their journey as usual. Following Nami all the way to Kokoyashi Village, Luffy would face off against Arlong and defeat him relatively easily. From there, Luffy wouldn't really struggle with anything until he finally comes face to face with Captain Smoker at Loguetown. You see, despite Luffy's crazy regeneration and strength, without haki, he wouldn't be able to do anything against a skilled Logia like Smoker. Not being able to hit Smoker, Luffy would slowly start to get angry and would allow his dark side to take control once more. He would then release a huge, uncontrolled burst of Conqueror's haki. This strong haki would stun Smoker for a while, allowing Luffy to escape back to the ship. So everything went well, right? Well, not really, because this sudden haki activation would instantly alert Imu to Luffy's presence in the world. So, as the Straw Hats leave Loguetown and enter the Grand Line, Luffy would start having thoughts and hallucinations of Imu, who would try to take control of him. Refusing to give up control of his body, Luffy would continue fighting Imu's influence until he eventually passes out. After a few hours, Luffy would finally wake up inside Crocus's lighthouse. Crocus would then tell him that his crew had been busy dealing with a couple of Baroque Works agents while he was knocked out. Frustrated by the fact that he was too weak to help his crew, Luffy would begin to lose control once again in front of Crocus. A blob of darkness would begin to form around Luffy, forcing Crocus to use medicine to sedate him. After Luffy finally calms down, Crocus would then start explaining everything he knew about covenants and their power. However, Crocus would still be confused about how Luffy was able to resist Imu's control, saying that there might be something special about him. Anyways, Crocus would then offer to chop Luffy's arm off for him, which would get rid of the Covenant. Luffy would seriously consider this for a while, but his crew would eventually talk him out of it, saying that if he ever lost control again, they would be there to help him. After saying goodbye to Crocus and Laboon, the Straw Hats would continue their journey and soon arrive at Whiskey Peak. Things would go mostly the same here, with Zoro fighting off 100 bounty hunters while the crew learns Vivi's story and decide to help her. From here, we can skip the Little Garden and Drum Island arcs, as those would go pretty much the same and nothing major would happen until the crew reaches Alabasta. Once there, they would meet Ace and soon decide to head for Crocodile's base. After getting captured and escaping, Luffy would soon come face to face with Crocodile for the first time. And this time, he would be a much bigger threat to Crocodile than before. You see, due to his insane regeneration, Luffy's overall fighting style would be much more reckless, as he knows that he can't get hurt. So he would take anything Crocodile throws at him head on, completely confusing the warlord. Now, even though he is able to regenerate from almost nothing, it would still be impossible for Luffy to actually hurt Crocodile without haki. However, as the battle rages on, Luffy's hands would start getting sweaty thanks to the hot desert heat and his non-stop attempts at breaking through Crocodile's Logia form. Just as he was about to give up, Luffy would notice a couple of his punches beginning to land. Before long, he would realize that his sweat is most likely why his attacks were able to hit. Using his head for once, Luffy would destroy a nearby barrel of water and cover himself with it. He would then jump straight at Crocodile, hugging him with his arms and making sure the water covers him completely. Although he would get stabbed by Crocodile's hook multiple times, Luffy would easily regenerate all the damage while hitting Crocodile with everything he has. The beating would eventually knock Crocodile out, while Robin would be left stunned by Luffy's abilities. Shortly after, she would decide to join the crew while Smoker and the Marines arrest Crocodile for his crimes. After a big feast at the palace, the crew would bid Vivi farewell and head straight to Jaya next. Instead of letting Bellamy go this time, Luffy would beat him up directly at the bar with a single punch. Bellamy's crew wouldn't even dare to intervene. Walking out, Luffy would meet Blackbeard, and the two would have a chat about people's dreams. It's at this point that Blackbeard would notice the mark on Luffy's arm, but he would assume it was likely nothing since Luffy is far too young to be a God's Knight. However, he would decide to keep a close eye on him. With that done, the crew would follow the steps and ride the knockup stream all the way to Skypiea. Fast forward some time, and Enel would eventually end up taking out all of the Straw Hats with a devastating bolt of lightning, leaving only Luffy standing. He and Enel would then begin their battle by exchanging a few blows. All of Enel's attacks would basically either bounce off or pass straight through Luffy's body. Getting desperate, Enel would decide to target Luffy's crewmates instead in order to gain the advantage. With his crewmates in danger, Luffy would get angry and would once again almost fall under Imu's control. However, he would quickly snap out of it and land a finishing blow on Enel before he could harm his crew. Meanwhile, back at Marioa, Imu would start getting really angry as he realizes that he might have given immense power to someone he can't fully control. Anyway, with Enel defeated, the crew would take the squid balloon back to the Blue Sea and land somewhere around Long Ring Long Land. After quickly dealing with Foxy, Luffy and the others would soon encounter Aokiji. The Admiral would then cut Luffy with his ice abilities, but Luffy would easily regenerate. Confused about why some random guy was suddenly attacking him, Luffy would attempt to fight back, but would suddenly get frozen in an ice prison. Inspecting Luffy a bit closer, Aokiji would realize that he has a covenant on his arm and would be confused about how he got it. Either way, Aokiji wouldn't think too hard about it, and considering Luffy is Garp's grandson, he would let his crew go. From there, the Water 7 arc would go pretty much the same until Luffy's confrontation with CP9. You see, at this point, Robin would still be unsure about her place on the crew and would likely decide to leave with them like in the original story. From there, the battle between the Straw Hats and CP9 would begin, with Luffy angrily punching Blueno and sending him flying. However, Kaku and Lucci would immediately jump in to help, piercing Luffy with their finger pistol ability. As Luffy regenerates from this, Lucci would immediately figure out that this pirate somehow has an abyssal covenant. Lucci would then attempt to question Luffy and ask him why he was siding against the world government, but Luffy would just ignore the question and punch Lucci straight in the face. Considering CP9 members didn't know hockey at this point, Luffy would easily regenerate from any attacks and eventually beat them all down with Sanji and Zoro's help. Lucci would call Luffy a monster because of his abilities, but Luffy would reply that he is okay with being a monster if it means saving his friends. Hearing this and seeing how Luffy fought to free her, Robin would burst into tears and decide to rejoin the Straw Hats. After holding a funeral for the going merry, the Straw Hats would get back to Water 7, where Garp would be waiting for them. However, instead of fighting Luffy, Garp would just ask him to listen. He would then tell Luffy about his history and everything he knows about the Covenant. He would also warn him that using that power is dangerous and that his mind can get taken over by evil. After seriously listening to everything Garp said, Luffy would assure him that he wouldn't lose control and would be careful about how he uses this ability going forward. Not wanting Imu to get his hands on Luffy, Garp would just let him and his entire crew go, telling them to stay out of trouble. Eventually, Frankie would finally unveil the 1000 Sunny, and the crew would continue their journey. Reaching the Florian Triangle, the crew would come across Brook and invite him on board. The rest of this arc would go pretty much the same, with Luffy and the crew easily defeating Moria and his lackeys. However, it's when the crew arrives on Sabaody that things would start getting interesting. So remember how angry Luffy was when he saw Cammy being sold in the auction house? Yeah, it was probably the angriest we ever saw him. So after punching St. Carlos with everything he had, Luffy would start losing control again due to his rage, which would open the door for Imu to finally use Dami Reversi on him. As he started transforming into a demon, everyone would panic, not knowing what to do. However, suddenly, Luffy would get cut clean in half by a powerful Conqueror's Haki Slash. Rayleigh would soon reveal himself and use his Haki to expel the remaining darkness from Luffy. With this, Luffy would transform back into his human form. He would instantly fall unconscious due to the immense physical and mental toll of resisting Imu's control. Observing Luffy a bit closer, Rayleigh would realize that it was the kid Shanks told him about and would decide to take him to Shacky's bar. With Luffy still out cold, Rayleigh would introduce himself to the rest of the crew and explain to them what happened earlier. Soon, Kizaru and Kuma would arrive with the Pacifistas. The rest of the Straw Hats and Rayleigh would all fight together against them and pretend that Luffy abandoned them in order to escape. Although Rayleigh would be able to keep Kizaru at bay, the rest of the Straw Hats would still get teleported to various islands by Kuma. A month later, Luffy would finally wake up from his coma in Shacky's bar. Carefully helping him to his feet, Rayleigh would reveal who he is to Luffy. Luffy would then learn about Shanks having a covenant just like him, and about how the Roger Pirates fought the Gods Knights in the past. Luffy would then ask Rayleigh about his crew, and Rayleigh would explain that they are probably safe, although he doesn't really know where they are. Feeling guilty for letting his crew down, Luffy would thank Rayleigh for the information. However, the next thing he learns would completely break him. Seeing Ace's face in the newspaper he found on the table, Luffy would soon learn that his brother had been executed by the Marines while he was unconscious. This would completely break him, and he would instantly burst into tears. He would blame himself for not being strong enough to resist Imu and would take Rayleigh's sword to cut off his arm. Rayleigh would manage to stop him at the last second and calm him down. He would then tell Luffy about Haki. He would explain how it is a mysterious power that could make him much stronger and could also help him control the Covenant so that he wouldn't lose control ever again. With this, the time skip would happen as usual, only this time, Luffy would end up becoming much stronger than in the original story. After his training was complete, Luffy would finally learn to use his Conqueror's Haki to completely block Imu's influence. Here are some other things that would change during the time skip. For example, Zoro would learn how to cut someone like Luffy down since Mihawk thought it would be best to teach him a technique like this in case his captain ever lost control. Meanwhile, Sanji wouldn't be able to level up his skills very much since Ivankov never escaped prison in this scenario. Other than that, all of the other Straw Hats would basically go through the same journey they did in the main timeline. Reuniting with his crewmates 2 years later, Luffy and the crew would finally set sail again. Under the sea, the crew would soon reach Fishman Island. Everything here would go the same, except that the crew wouldn't meet Jinbei at all. You see, since Luffy never broke into Impel Down, it's likely that Jinbei would still be in prison. Even if he somehow managed to escape, he wouldn't know who Luffy even was, so they would never become friends. Anyway, Luffy and the Straw Hats would soon deal with Hody Jones and Vanderdecken and continue their journey towards Punk Hazard. Not much would change here either. Luffy's crew would help free the kids while he forms an alliance with Law and defeats Caesar. Momonosuke and Kinemon would also tag along, and the crew would soon head for Dressrosa. There, Luffy would enroll in the Coliseum tournament for Ace's Devil Fruit. He would drop out as soon as Sabo showed up though, and then focus all of his attention on Doflamingo instead. However, this would be the first time in the story that a fight wouldn't really go Luffy's way. You see, Luffy is in the new world now, and he is dealing with people who know how to use Haki. Doflamingo specifically can also use Conqueror's Haki, and probably has information about the God Knights and their abilities due to being a celestial dragon. So, during Luffy's big fight against Doflamingo, his regeneration abilities would be put to the test against sharp, Haki-coated strings. Noticing Luffy's covenant mark early on, Doflamingo would get extremely angry and would want to kill Luffy for being one of Imu's pawns. However, Luffy would tell him that he is free to do whatever he wants and works for no one. Doflamingo would then completely overwhelm Luffy with thousands of micro cuts all over his body. Although Conqueror's Haki wouldn't quite be enough to take out a person with an abyssal covenant, it would still do some real harm to Luffy. This would be the first time Luffy's regeneration started slowing down a bit, and he would find himself in serious danger. So, remembering what Rayleigh taught him, Luffy would decide to transform into Gear 4 for the first time. Transforming into Bound Man, Luffy would use his enhanced strength and Haki to knock Doflamingo out with a Kongun punch to the face, getting cut into hundreds of pieces in the process. Lying exhausted on the ground, Luffy's body parts would slowly start coming back together on their own. Soon enough, the crew would find Luffy passed out just as Fujitora would arrive to arrest them. With the help of Dressrosa's citizens, the crew would escape similarly to the original story and get back to their ship. Now, with Luffy becoming more and more famous in the new world, it would become easier for Imu to keep track of him, which would prove to be a really bad thing for him very soon. Anyway, before that, the Straw Hats would arrive at 𝐿. Once there, they would soon find the minx in terrible shape after their battle with Jack. As Chopper and the others would help heal them, Zunisha would suddenly feel Luffy's presence on her back. Zunisha would sense something familiar about Luffy at first, but would then be horrified after sensing that Luffy has Imu's covenant. Once Momo deciphers what Zunisha is saying, Luffy would ask him to explain to Zunisha how he has his powers under control and that there is nothing to fear. Hearing this, Zunisha would finally calm down. While all this was happening, the Straw Hats would notice that Sanji had somehow gone missing. This is when they would find his letter explaining how he went to Big Mom's territory and telling them not to follow him. Well, this obviously wouldn't stop Luffy, who would instantly head there with the same group he did in the original story. While Luffy is busy dealing with Cracker, the reverie would proceed as usual. The main topic of this timeline's reverie would be the seemingly immortal captain of the Straw Hat Pirates. Wanting to finally put an end to Luffy, Imu would order the Holy Knights to go and find him as soon as possible. Back on Whole Cake, after their assassination attempt on Big Mom fails, both the Fire Tank Pirates and the Straw Hats would rush back to their ships to escape. Luffy would end up battling Katakuri soon after, while Sanji and Pudding try to stop Big Mom by making her a wedding cake. Everything here would play out mostly the same, with Luffy defeating Katakuri a bit easier due to his regeneration and eventually escaping the island. But this is where things would get interesting, because in Wano, Luffy would encounter his toughest opponent so far. And no, I'm not talking about Kaido. You see, after arriving at Wano and learning advanced Haki, Luffy would eventually engage Kaido on top of Onigashima. However, after fighting for a while, things would instantly get a lot more complicated once Shamrock, one of the Holy Knights, appears on the battlefield to take out Luffy. Launching a strong attack at Luffy, Luffy wouldn't even try to dodge, thinking he was actually Shanks. After getting hit directly and regenerating, Shamrock would realize that this is definitely the kid Imu was talking about. Realizing that there is something not quite right about Shanks, Luffy would yell at Shamrock and ask him who he is, but he wouldn't get an answer. Instead, Shamrock would place his palm on the floor and cast an abyss to summon Gunko, another Holy Knight. Immediately, Gunko's body would begin to shift and Imu's essence would leak out of her. The tendrils would then immediately strike both Luffy and Kaido, entering their bodies and sending a shocking sensation throughout them. After minutes of screaming, both Luffy and Kaido would eventually get Dami reversied in front of everyone. With a mindless desire to cause chaos and destruction, both Kaido and Luffy would advance toward the remaining Straw Hats. As all hope seemed lost, Zoro would prepare his swords to face off against his own captain, but just then, something impossible would happen. A bright light would start to appear around Luffy's body and slowly overwhelm the demonic essence that had overtaken him. As the light gets brighter and brighter, Luffy would eventually start laughing and emerge from the darkness in his Nika form. At the same time, the covenant mark on his arm would begin to morph into a symbol of the sun, and he would become completely free of Imu's control. The drums of liberation would suddenly start playing across the battlefield, and within seconds, Kaido would regain control of his body too. Absolutely shocked by this, Shamrock and the possessed Gunko would immediately launch an attack that would get easily countered by both Kaido and Luffy. Working together, Kaido and Luffy would easily overpower the Holy Knights. Angered by the fact that these two intruders interrupted his fight against Luffy, Kaido would deal some heavy damage to Shamrock with a roaring thunder Bagua. Seeing Luffy's Nika transformation, Imu would get shocked and immediately recall both of his subordinates. With the God Knights dealt with, both Luffy and Kaido would start laughing. However, this wouldn't last long, as both of them would quickly turn their attention back to each other to finish what they started. This battle wouldn't last long though, and using his Toon abilities, Luffy would easily deal with Kaido the same way he did in the original story. With his covenant broken at this point and turned into a sun symbol, Luffy would finally be a free man and wouldn't have to worry about Imu corrupting him ever again. Click on this video next, where I explained what would have happened if Luffy could steal devil fruits. What are you waiting for? Click it!